Oh, I guess it's time to go. Good morning. Acts chapter 22. So, who wants to tell us how we got to Acts 22 and what happened right prior to this, to getting here? What happened in the last chapter? Anybody?
Paul had been traveling and decided to go against others' wishes, decided to still go ahead and go to Jerusalem. Travel back to Jerusalem.
The plan was to get to Jerusalem. Okay? And so he ran into what? There towards the middle of the chapter 21. Ran into some more opposition, right? Just like he has been. Only the Jews from Asia now seemingly are coming back to roost continually. So at the end of that chapter, he's literally arrested, right? And they take him in chains and take him on to Jerusalem. So, as we start chapter 22, Paul begins his defense. Okay? What in this defense do you find interesting, noteworthy, application-driven for us? Nothing? Chapter 23? Oh. Well, I'll start it off. He starts again by saying who he is and basically where he came from, right? So he starts talking to them in the Hebrew language. He starts the chapter out by brothers and fathers, pulling them in again. We've seen this over and over again with him, of pulling them in to be with him. Verse 3, he says, I am a Jew. Wait a minute. I thought he was a child of God, a Christian, follower of Christ, disciple.
Religious status, his ethnic status is that he's a Jew, and for them, they saw those two as intertwined, but not necessary.
Right, and I think we think more of, if you say you're a Jew, that's your religious status, but it was literally your nation. That was who you were, just like we consider ourselves to be Americans, right? So it's a good point. I'm a Jew, right? And then he goes on the famous statement that, hey, I was educated by Gamaliel. I was at his feet. Telling exactly how, and then he follows that up and he says, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers. What does that mean? From all of our other studies of that, what does that mean?
The way they had all been raised, the Old Testament, the traditions,
Okay.
everything their lives were grounded in.
What sect was he?
Pharisees.
Pharisee. Isn't that what the Pharisees were known for, of being the strictest of the Jewish nation? Right? They were the ones that were very strict, and so that's what he's referring to, I believe, to the strictest manner. And later, we get down to 23, he'll literally say, Hebrew of Hebrews, I'm that man. I'm that Pharisee. And I was. So, by him talking about this, what does that do? Or what does that say about him and how he's trying to reach these people?
He's establishing common ground.
He's establishing common ground.
We see over and over the same. Paul is the same, no matter who he is facing or who he is working with. He establishes that common ground, however needed. His tone adjusts for the people he's working with or speaking to or trying to help. But we see that same line of, this is who I am. And within that, this is who I am, you see who he's working with because you see that common ground. This is my story. This is how I got to where I am today. This is why you need to listen to God.
Okay? All right, good. Verse 4 says, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, and did this under the auspice of the high priest, right? And then he's going to go on and talk about his conversion, right? But when you think of Paul, and he sees these people coming after him, these Pharisees coming after him like they were, do you think he relates to them? And that's what he's trying to get across to them. Guys, I've been where you are. I was what you are. And he has empathy for them, and I think further than that, he has great hope for them. If I can see it, so can you. And you can make that change as well in your life. And that's the hope he has for them. Isn't that the hope we all have to have when we're talking to people, trying to convince them and convert them? Mike?
The relatability factor is the most important thing because a lot of people try to skip that part, but that's how you really communicate with your audience and get them on the same page as you, and so you build that bridge so what you're talking about becomes so much more effective because you're understanding where they're coming from.
Yeah. Got to have a relationship, that's for sure. So, these were very zealous people, weren't they? These Jews that were coming after him were very zealous. What does that say about zeal? It can be misplaced. That's exactly right. It can be misplaced. And just because somebody is zealous does not necessarily mean that they are right. It may mean they're right, but it may not also. Brad.
The end of verse 3, what did your translation say? I was thoroughly trained in, or
The law of our fathers,
the law of our fathers.
being zealous for God,
Yeah,
as all of you are this day.
yeah. This may not have any significance, but in NIV it says trained in the law of our ancestors. He does say, I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I just wonder, if there's any significance to this idea of the law of our fathers versus the law of God. I don't know if there's any significance there, but obviously we know that they took the law of God and then they, kind of tried to distill it down to the finer, do's and don'ts. Okay, here's where we're gonna, we know we can't build a fire on the Sabbath. So, I have a Jewish friend that he can't turn on his lights because most electric plants, the source of the energy is like a coal-fired plant. And so you're caught by turning on your lights technically you are causing a fire to be built somewhere. Is the same thing is true of my friend doesn't get in a car on the Sabbath, and he won't, like, he doesn't drive anywhere, he won't let others drive him somewhere. And it's because a 4-stroke engine is thousands of little fires being kindled in your engine, right? So, like, they took this law of God and then distilled it down to all of these finer points. So I just wonder if there's any, like, any of that in the back of his head, like, you know, look, I was trained in all of the finer points. I get all that, but then there's the instruction of God that compels me to do what God wants me to do as well. And sometimes those are at odds, what our ancestors have developed as our list of norms and rules. And he's trained in all that. He gets it. I know all the reasons. I know all the laws. But then God stepped in here and gave me some new instruction that I must follow.
Yeah, it's very true for his sake, because Jesus actually appeared to him, as we're going to see a little later here again. It's going to be recounted. And so, yes, I think the Jews thought it was one and the same.
Right.
The law of our fathers is the law of God. That's what they believed. Now, did they understand that they had made all these other additions to it and nuances about it? I don't think they did. I don't think they got it for many years. And some may never.
Still today?
Yeah, well, some still today. I mean, you look at the Amish folks, they're kind of along the same lines. That they'll talk about the spirits being in the air, and you can't combine them in a tire, and you can't put them through an engine, all that kind of thing. So there's all kinds of things that people delineate and start making nuances about what we understand. Jesse?
As I read this, I just think about how wise God was for choosing Saul, Paul, right, to be able to go to both the Gentiles and the Jews. Steve often talks about, like, as a Jew, to the Jew, I became a Jew, and how I'm trying to think like them. What better example than this extremely zealous character for the law, who had a reputation for being zealous for the law and persecuting the way, to then go and talk to this mob who's trying to be zealous for God and kill him, you know, and meet them at their level. So this defense is kind of critically important, but also it was so well orchestrated by God, in my opinion, right? Like, simply because he could go to exactly the most extreme and go, yes, I was there, and I sat at the feet of Gamaliel. I persecuted people much like you're doing today. It's really incredible, obviously the foresight, but it's interesting to see how it plays out specifically for God's purpose.
Yeah, and that's why I lean toward the fact that he has the same hope for them. That very reason is because they're very zealous. If you can convict somebody and change their heart and change who they're going to follow, then they'll become just as strong and just as zealous in their new understanding. So the only other thing that I would say about that is, obviously they had a desire or a devotion to God. And they thought they were following it just like Saul had thought. But true desire and true devotion literally has to go to what you was talking about, to God's will. And is it God's will? Are we following God's will? And do we need to make adjustments in our lives that better align us with God's will? And that's true devotion at that point. Other comments? All right, as we go on through the chapter, he starts recounting his conversion. And one of the things that I noticed here, I don't know, what do you guys think about this conversion and how he recounts it here? What's your thoughts on it? I mean, we've talked about it when it happened in chapter 9. He's going to talk about it again in chapter 26. Yeah.
There's another revelation that I don't think we knew before now, which is when he returned to Jerusalem, verse 17, and the Lord spoke to him and said, quick, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. I don't remember that being mentioned before now, or anywhere else.
You reading my notes?
So yeah, I know that stood out to me as well.
Yeah, it definitely stood out to me. You think of Jesus appearing to him on the road to Damascus, right? And that's all we talk about. But a little later in the chapter, he says, when he's in Jerusalem, he falls into a trance, and Jesus appears to him again and talks to him about what he's going to do and what he wants him to do. And when I get down to that part, let's just go ahead and skip down to that part. What was Paul's response to him there, to the Lord?
They know what I did. They know where I came from.
And what does that mean to you? Why do you think Paul brings that up? I think it could be two different ways. But
He was so zealous, like we said, about following the law. In my thoughts, he was always like, that's why God chose him. Who better to listen to than the man that thought he was so right in what he was doing, but then when he learned different was like, wait, hold up. And he's not doing it, there's no physical violence in what he's doing. There's no beating them over the head to change what they're doing. There is such a change in him.
okay. What other thought there?
It seems to me that Paul is trying to say, but I should be received well by these people because of my past history with them. And God is saying, nope, you need to go. And that's the way I've been reading it, but maybe I'm not.
Okay, so that's one way I looked at it. It's like, Lord, don't you know who I am?
Well, I didn't take
I'm the most zealous individual. You chose me. I'm the one that should be going to them. Now, I'm not saying that was Paul's attitude. I'm saying that could be. No, they should listen to me. Here's my credentials, right? But the Lord says, no. Get out of there. They're not going to listen to you. Get out of there and go to the Gentiles. Or Paul could have just simply feared for his life, having known that he had persecuted him, and said, yeah, Lord, this is what I did, so yeah, they're not going to listen to me. I agree, they're not going to listen to me. This is going to be tough. This is going to be hard to deal with. Jesse.
Someone that is so zealous going to, prison and that kind of thing, obviously it feels a little extreme for us, but was maybe valued back then. But I feel like Paul was so humiliated, and I don't mean like embarrassing, but he was brought so low. It actually set him on the perfect trajectory to be able to teach and instruct and things like that. When I say humiliated, I mean everything he's ever learned and known was quite instantly reversed or shattered or whatever you want to call it, right? Like, I mean, he was directly approached and said, guess what? Your entire belief system has been wrong, or some of the fundamentals have been wrong. The way that you've approached this is wrong. And so the way that you see him being able to read the audience, I feel like it's just kind of incredible. And so everywhere he goes, including to the Gentiles, specifically to the Gentiles, the way that he treats some of the congregations that are having difficulties and stuff like that, I don't know, I just feel like this reversal of his, all of his previously held beliefs put him in such a perfect, compassionate, and merciful mindset to go. And sometimes that happens to us. And I think if it does, it feels so uncomfortable, but I think it's a value. At least I see value here in Paul, where a lot of the things that he assumed to be right were wrong, and he was able to kind of use that on behalf of spreading the gospel.
Yeah. I think that's very possible. Very possible.
So I was looking at other translations of that same verse, and I think the reason I leaned the way I did was because the version I've been reading is CSB, and it starts that verse with verse 19, but I said. And so I think that's why in my head I was putting him at like, oh wait a minute, I can do this. But I was looking at all these other translations, and it seems that even the translators aren't really sure what the conjunction should be there. If it should be and, but, if there should even be one in there. I mean, all these different translations have different words, so I can see how you get the other perspective that you were saying.
Okay?
It's interesting.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? So we could go back, I would like to go back just a little bit here to Ananias. We're told a little bit more about Ananias here than what we were in Acts 9. Okay? And what do we see about Ananias? What's the facts about him? Back to like verse 12.
Similar background as Paul himself. He was devout to the law itself. He was a Jew, well received, well spoken of.
So like Saul, Paul, he is using a Jew to carry out where things need to go with Paul. He's using a devout man. So you ever wonder, at least I do, I wonder whatever happened with Ananias. Did he actually obey the gospel? Did he fall in line with that, or did he remain a Jew? We're not told. We don't know. It's just something he's like, wonder what happened there. After being so instrumental in getting Paul to be what he was appointed to be. So another thing that we talk about Paul's mission going to the Gentiles, right? Look at verse 15. And what does verse 15 say? Because we see totally different that he goes, every time he goes to a city, he goes to the synagogue, right? And when they start turning away or start putting up a fuss, then he turns and goes to the Gentiles. What does verse 15 say? Is his mission? Yes, Jim. All people. Your mission is to go to all people and be my witness. And so we shouldn't even find it interesting or strange that he would be talking to both Gentiles and Jews, because that's been his mission from the beginning. Because we kind of always kind of throw it back that he was supposed to go to Gentiles. Okay. Any other thoughts before we move on into the storyline? Yes?
Something I noticed this time that I hadn't caught before was in verse 22, and it was like, the Jews listened to him until this word
Yeah, specifically the resurrection was involved with that. But yes, the Gentiles, that they didn't have to be, meet all the criteria that the Jewish nation had to meet. Yes.
Isn't it interesting how triggered they were to the point that they just stopped listening? They listened to him up to that point. They stopped listening and started shouting their side of things, or what they wanted to do, and they weren't listening anymore. And how human that is.
How does that apply to us today? We've got something set in our mind, what we've been taught and what we've learned thus far in our lives, and somebody else comes along and teaches us something a little different than what we have known, and we stop listening just like that. Nope, not going to listen to that. That's not what I've been taught. How about listening and see if I've missed something? Because Lord knows I'm not perfect. And I never will be. How about listening and seeing what is there? And if it's incorrect, then we can help them change that. But if we are incorrect, then maybe we need to make a change.
And to that end, I mean, how we perceive other people who are still in, to use a phrase that that a friend of mine uses, she said, I went through a long period of deconstruction before I went through reconstruction of her faith. And her deconstruction was so long, it was so critical of what she had been raised to believe. I wondered if she was coming back, if she was ever coming back from that. But her reconstruction of her faith has been so it's incredible. She is so firmly rooted in what she believes and why now, that I'm just really amazed. And I think back to where I was perceiving her from the outside while she was in that deconstruction mode. And I'm thinking, there's no way she's coming back from this. She is being so critical. I just can't see it coming back. That was me, though, kind of stopping listening in a way, because I wasn't seeing that she was on her way to the reconstruction. I mean,
Well, I think there's a danger, okay, that somebody could get into, and if she were to have died during that period of time, I'm going to leave it up to the Lord to decide her fate. I can't decide that for her, but I do know His grace is there. But whether that covers that, I don't know. But it does. I pray that it covers me from all the time that I was a child to where I'm at today, and everything that I've changed my mind on. I pray that He was there with me and giving me that grace that whole period of time.
But in a lot of ways, she reminds me so much of Paul because of how vocal and public she has been through that entire process. I mean, like, she's putting all of this on Facebook, and I'm reading, like, oh my goodness, where are you going with this? But when she started reconstructing and being like, look, this is why I believe what I believe, she has pulled other people who have deconstructed and gone the other way.
Yeah.
She's pulling them back to the Lord because of what she's doing. I just think that's really important that we don't just write them off for deconstructing.
Well, I think there's something to be said at that in the fact that it was never her faith to begin with. She was following somebody else. She was following her parents. She was following the preacher. She was following the elders. She was following somebody rather than it being her faith. And what she's done is recreated that, and now it's her faith.
Agreed.
That's the only thing I can say to that. I mean, I think it's great. People have to get it to that point that it's part of them. It is them. Steve, you were going to say something.
That's all right, go ahead.
Right?
You want to see somebody remain reverent to God during that time. But then you think about, well, reverent to God according to who, right? And you see Jesus healing people on the Sabbath when he knew that was not going to go over well, plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath when he knew that was against the norms and traditions of the fathers. So them looking on, I'm sure, interpreted Jesus' actions as an irreverent deconstructing of the faith. And they wanted to punish him for it, right? But Jesus was actually reverent to God in his deconstructing of the norms and the rules of the culture. And yet it didn't look that way to some people. So we all have to make the best judgment that we can. And yeah, I don't want to make a ruling on anybody because that's God's part in this. And
I know that God is a just God. I know that for a fact. Steve?
I listened to this, and maybe it's my age, but I like to look at the old paths where I can find them in the scriptures. I'm concerned that we look a lot at new authors, John Mark Hicks, F. LaGard Smith, Root, Stilton Grape Juice coming to the table, books like this. We think they've got something because our parents didn't have that. They brought us up. I look at the scriptures and say, I don't need a new hermeneutic. I need to go back and understand the hermeneutic and just understand the scriptures correctly. And so when we think about something new, are we looking for something new because we don't want to follow what our parents taught us? Are we looking for something new because it's not exciting to be back like the old generations? We need to think about this and understand that when we go to the scriptures, and that's where we find it. There's been men writing for centuries to try to explain the scriptures. Until we get into the scriptures understanding ourselves without having the help of all these other people, and all these type of books, and all these new ideas, we're still going to struggle. Our children and our grandchildren may say our parents didn't have it right either. I'm not going that far. I'm going to stay with the scriptures. If I can go to the scriptures and read that and study that, I don't believe God made the scriptures for me to have a concord or a commentary or some man's book. I believe the scriptures are there for me to comprehend and understand. So maybe it's my age, but I hear a new wave and I hear new things going on. And I've heard them for 60 years I've been in the Lord's church. There's nothing new under the sun. Same thing Paul faced, we faced. Same things our forefathers faced, we faced. And look at that, just a word of caution. Don't just look at it for change's sake. And throw away everything you were taught. If you look at the Jews here, they're actually standing firm to what they were taught. Now, they were having to be untaught to be retaught. And I don't argue with the fact that there are things that we need to be untaught and be retaught. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying we need to find the truth of that, because that's what agrees with common reality. So just from an old man, just a word of caution. Be careful of what we look at. Try to think we've got something new.
Well, I think to your point, I think whether it's in written form, in a commentary, or some article, or something that a man has written, the same thing happens within the church. With men who are older, who are well studied, and they say this is the way it has to be, and this is what it needs to be. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they're coming up with a different scenario than what their parents knew, and that's, I think there's a danger, believe me, that if we look at that stuff and we let it go too far, it can very much be a danger to taking you away, okay? On the other hand, it's about, to me, it's about becoming, it's either your faith or it's not the people that studied it before you. It's not the people that have taught you. It's not their faith. Your response, they're not going to stand in your place in judgment. You're going to stand in judgment. And so if you have learned something and not made the changes in your life, you're going to answer for it. They won't. Neither will the ones that are coming after you. They're not going to stand in your place in judgment either. We each have to go to the scripture and figure it out. Thoughts? All right, good discussion. So, I'm sorry?
Their answer to him was not, let's discuss this, or I don't understand what you're saying, or maybe I should teach you better. It was, this man doesn't deserve to live.
Right.
That's a little extreme, but.
A little.
Very extreme. But sometimes I think we see that, not physically, but we see that same attitude amongst brethren. Comes the part of you can't have fellowship with them. You must put them out of your life. Okay? So, when he says, go to the Gentiles, wouldn't that be totally against what Saul even knew from his being raised as a Jew? But yet you think of Jesus and his example. What did he do with the Samaritan woman? He talked with her, right? Well, what are you talking to me for? I'm a Samaritan. He was the very essence of what Jesus was telling Saul, Paul now, this is what you're going to do. You're going to go to the Gentiles. You're going to go to all people. And, if you look back there in John 4, and then you go on down in verse 34 and 35, he literally teaches his disciples, after that has happened, he teaches them about it and what they needed to do and why he talked to them. All right. So, down through verse 25, basically, maybe, 25, he's talking about, he's given his defense as, I'm a Jew. What does he change to in verse 25? I'm a Roman. Right? Yeah. He's going to use whatever avenue that he has to be able to try to reach people. I'm a Roman. So don't you treat me like I'm some outcast. And a note that I put here is I don't believe he's doing this, talking about being a Jew and or now being a Roman to primarily save his own life. I don't think that's the issue here, is it? It's so that he can complete his mission. What's his mission? To be able to witness to all the government officials, to anybody and everybody. And he needed to go on to Rome to do that. What else do we see here in the latter part of this chapter that's important for us to grab hold of? I found it interesting down at the end of the chapter that while the Jews think they have power, think they have control of stuff, what we see at the end of this chapter is the Romans were in control. The Romans were literally in control. When you look at verse 30, he unbound him and commanded the chief priest and all the council to meet. Okay, Jews, you're going to do it on my terms now. You're going to meet because you're following my commands. Any other thoughts? Yes, Steve.
I think if I can remember now, I'm trying to remember something. You can purchase Roman citizenship, but if you did not have the same rights as the one who was born a Roman,
Right.
as a Roman citizen. Because the centurion tells him it cost him a lot of money to be a Roman citizen. When you were a Roman citizen dealing with Jews, the Roman law took over instead of the Jewish law. That's why we see with Christ and putting it back to the Jews when he was asked, what do you want me to do with him? And Pilate tried to say he's not worthy of death. So what Paul is doing here, I see, is the Holy Spirit guiding him to say, get to Rome. I mean, I think there's a purpose for him to get before the leaders in the government of Rome. And I look at this and say, this is wisdom beyond my capabilities of what was it going to do to testify before the Roman government, because they were going to shut it down. But we see through his teaching, Agrippa and Felix and those, it did a lot of good for him to be there. It's done a lot of good for us to read about his account there. And so I look at that and say, it has to be the Spirit guiding him to do this, because Jesus didn't want him to be delivered at this time, get out of Jerusalem. How are you going to get out of Jerusalem? Jews are wanting to kill you. I'm a Roman. Get me before my people. Jews aren't my people as such. No, they're the law that I need to report to is the Roman law, not the Jewish law. In this particular case.
And I think that all plays into what I mentioned earlier. He had a mission,
He did.
and he was given that mission from day one when he was converted. This is where you need to go, and this is what's going to happen, and he wanted to make sure he could complete that mission.
And I think, Dawson, there's a lesson for us that we need to learn to use what we have to complete our mission. Don't just give up, but learn what we have to complete our mission.
I think there's a lot of times, though, that we have a trouble figuring out what our mission is. Literally.
And I think that goes back to the reason we do is we're listening to other men instead of listening to ourselves.
Well, or listen to Scripture. Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm talking about, our work with the Spirit.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Thanks. We'll begin 23 next Sunday.